So this is the second session on my conversation about Lama Zopa's book, How Things Exist. And just for a real quickie little bit of a review, a couple of things that I emphasized last week were Lama Zopa's teachings about the base and what did that mean. I will come back to that today. And because of that, I read the summary statements about a couple of books by a group of scholars called the Cowherds, which are, that's a funny name for a group of scholars, but it derives from a statement in one of Chandrakirti's books in which he says something about ordinary people who understand conventional existence, and the examples that he uses of ordinary people are cowherds. And so they took that name because they wanted to talk about conventional existence. Usually Buddhist teachings, like Lama Zopa's teaching, emphasize the ultimate truth among the two truths, which is not the conventional truth, not how things appear to us ordinarily, but it's the truth of how things actually exist. And Buddhist teachings usually emphasize that because I think the assumption is that, well, here we are in ordinary reality, we know about it, but what we don't know about is extraordinary reality or ultimate truth. But as the Cowherds point out, I don't think they point out, and I'm agreeing with this, is actually we don't really know what's going on in conventional reality. And that's going to be a bit of my theme, because it's typically not something that Buddhist teachers talk about, but it's something that's interested me a whole lot. And it should interest everybody a whole lot, because that's where we spend most of our time. And also understanding the relationship between conventional and ultimate realities, the world we live in as it really is, rather than as we presume it to be. Understanding that is the basis for bodhicitta, which is really emphasized in the Mahayana. And in fact, is the way that Lama Zopa opens his book. He talks about universal reality, universal responsibility, not universal reality. So, I'm going to start this evening with a quotation from the book Stages of Meditation, which I talked about extensively in July. But I want to go back to this quotation from His Holiness to start creating some context for us. And I think it's something very important to think about. So bear with me while I read this. It's not very long, but I think it's very important. Anyway, if you wanted to look it up, it's on page 131 of the book, Stages of Meditation. And the root text of this book was actually by Kamalashila, but I'm not going to go into that again because I'm going to read His Holiness's commentary on one of the passages in Kamalashila's book. His Holiness says, and again, this is on page 131, even among Buddhist schools of thought, the interpretation of the meaning of emptiness differs. And the reason I'm emphasizing the teaching on emptiness is because, as Lama Zopa says in his book, How Things Exist, that is how things exist. They're empty of inherent existence. That's the way they truly exist. Okay. So understanding emptiness is really the thing that we need to focus on. And this is an incredibly difficult subject. And it's something that is very easily misunderstood. And there are many ways of understanding the teachings on emptiness, even though they're central to all of Buddhist thought. You would think that the Buddhists would be all in agreement about what this important concept means. But guess what? They're not. Well, there's no Buddhist Pope, there's no Vatican, there's no Council of cardinals that's going to say what's doctrine, and this is what you better believe. But in the Buddhist world, it's quite different. It's much more along the lines of, well, this is what we think is going on, and you better check it out for yourself, which in its own way creates a little bit of chaos, but it's about as open-minded as you can get. It's kind of a funny religion that way. But anyway, back to this quotation about emptiness. Even among Buddhist schools of thought, the interpretation of the meaning of emptiness differs. The interpretation of the Chittamatra school is not acceptable to those who propound the Madhyamika philosophy. Likewise, the proponents of the Chittamatra school, too, have their own logic to refute the Madhyamika point of view, or viewpoint, rather. We need to develop a broad perspective, enabling us to see the wholeness of the Buddhist philosophy rather than its fragments. The views presented by the lower schools should directly or indirectly aid the practitioner in realizing the views of the higher schools. The above passage, which is what he's commenting on, and which I haven't quoted, the above passage deals with the selflessness of phenomena as it is presented exclusively in the Madhyamika school. According to this school, every phenomenon is a mere label imputed by the mind. So if you're reading Lama Zopa's book, and I hope you will, it's free. There's a link to it on the login page for this. Lama Zopa talks extensively about labeling the base. That's all we experience is the label. That's what His Holiness is talking about here. According to this school, which is the school of the Dalai Lama, for example, every phenomenon is a mere label imputed by the mind. It is not only external existence, but the mind that perceives the various categories of false phenomena that is devoid of true existence. So we'll get into this. Objects are devoid of true existence, they're empty, and the mind that cognizes them, that means that within you that's listening to me right now, is devoid or empty of true existence. That should unnerve you. In this way, Madhyamikas assert that all phenomena, external or internal, lack true existence or do not exist ultimately. When things appear to the mind, they appear to exist truly, but in reality, they lack such an identity. There is a discrepancy between the way things appear and the way they exist. And that is the key line. Okay, Jai, I will enable live transcript. Where was I? There is a discrepancy between the way things appear and the way they exist. That's sort of the key thing to try and keep in mind, because that sounds pretty straightforward. In other words, the way things appear to us is false. We live in a world of falsehood. Such a discrepancy is unacceptable as the ultimate nature of a phenomenon. Therefore, all phenomena are devoid of true existence. There's an awful lot packed into that line. So let me try and unpack, that passage. So let me try and unpack some of that stuff. Oh, I see a wagging tail in the background there, Jayla.
That's Tashi. He's a year old and he weighs 74 pounds.
Oh my goodness, and he's climbing all over you.
Yeah, he thinks he's in charge.
Well, we have a cat that only weighs 10 or 15 pounds, and she's not going to jump on me, but she might wander through the background here. Okay. Let me get into this in perhaps what might seem like an indirect way, which is by telling you some stories, or at least a story. Well, yeah, a longer story. When I was a graduate student, I decided that I wanted to do my doctoral studies in Tibetan Buddhism. And one of the reasons for that was I read a passage in a book by His Holiness. And this would be now 1976 or something like that, quite a long time ago, as it turns out. Anyhow, I read some material by His Holiness about the philosophy of emptiness, and I didn't understand a single word. It was completely and utterly incomprehensible to me. It's like gobbledygook. And I figured, if the Dalai Lama is teaching something that is utterly incomprehensible to me, it's worth studying. So I set about studying it. And I studied Nagarjuna as a graduate student. And I was not satisfied with what I was learning from my mentors in graduate school, one of whom was one of the more eminent modern Tibetologists that was alive at that time. So when I had the opportunity, I went to Dharamsala, India, to the Library of Tibetan Works and Archives to meet with the Lamas there, who I figured would maybe be able to answer some of the questions that I had that the scholars in the United States and in Europe couldn't answer. I got to the Library of Tibetan Works and Archives, and they hooked me up with somebody called Geshe Sonam Rinpoche. This was in 1982, who was one of the main teachers at the library at that time. And I told him what was on my mind. I told him what was concerning me, that I wasn't understanding in my studies of Nagarjuna. And I asked specifically a certain question. And I said, I can't get an answer from anybody about this particular question. And we were sitting together in the museum, which is where we had a table to work. And he said, well, there are three answers to that question. I thought, holy crap, I can't get any answers from any of the scholars in the West. And here I am sitting with this Tibetan scholar, and he says, there are three. I thought, okay, I'm in the right place. And what ended up happening was we completely retranslated the work that I'd been doing on Nagarjuna. And I collected the oral commentary from Gen Sonam Rinchen on Nagarjuna, and it turned into this book, Nagarjuna's 70 Stanzas, which I guess I'm flogging here when I'm pointing this out to you. So it was very interesting to be working with Gen Sonam Rinchen. I did that over a couple of years. But here's the point. I mean, maybe that's a nice story, but there's a point to the story. Here's the point to the story. As we were working through the material and getting into this emptiness concept, emptiness, 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 something began to happen to me as much emotionally as intellectually. And I began to fall to what's called the nihilistic extreme. Now, you know, Buddhism is known as the path, which is the middle way. The middle way is between asserting absolutism and nihilism. Things absolutely exist or nothing exists whatsoever. It's a total dream. Buddhism goes down the razor's edge between the middle of those things. I, however, in working with this material, emotionally and intellectually started falling to the extreme of emptiness. That it's like nothingness. There's nothing here. There's nothing that really matters. Now, excuse me. Nagarjuna himself says, and Nagarjuna is the great philosopher about emptiness, if you don't know, the 2nd, 3rd century AD or CE, depending upon how you like it. And Nagarjuna's thought influenced all Buddhists in Asia who are Mahayana Buddhists. Anyhow, Nagarjuna says in one of his treatises, an incorrectly grasped emptiness is like grabbing a snake by the tail. What happens if you grab a snake by the tail? It bites you, and it poisons you, and it can kill you. That's the danger of nihilism. And I had fallen into the extreme of nihilism. And all the conversations I had with Gemson and Rinchen did not pull me out of that nihilism. Try as we did to get a clearer understanding and get me back into the middle position, nothing worked. So finally, I decided that I needed real, I don't know, maybe I would say the big guns. I needed real help, like serious help, because I was in big trouble. And at that time, Ling Rinpoche, the former Ling Rinpoche, was still alive, and he was in residence in Dharamsala. Ling Rinpoche is, or was, His Holiness's senior teacher. He was the Ganden Tripa at the time. And, basically you couldn't imagine finding anybody else who could be more qualified to help you understand this concept of emptiness, which was troubling me and which I was having difficulty with. So I worked my way up the mountains to his home, and having gotten past the pair of humongous mastiffs that guarded him, sat down and had a brief conversation with him. And I told him what the problem was. And he graciously actually spent some time talking with me, because he was a very, very busy person. That was very extraordinary that he would spend any time talking with me at all, because I just came up there unannounced, which was really nervy of me and probably completely inappropriate, but I was in dire need. He was reading some letters as I was talking to him, and every once in a while he would look at me out of the corner of his eye and continue reading his letters. I told him what the problem was, and he stopped reading the letters. And he looked at me and he said, "There is a very subtle mind that goes from life to life. You should understand this." I went back to reading his letters. That was the end of the interview. I had no idea what he was talking about. None whatsoever. But that was the end of the interview. So I left and went back down to my hotel. And I wondered what the heck he meant. Well, what I later discovered was he was talking about the clear light mind, which you understand through the practice of Vajrayana or Tantra. Now, so this is important, not just for me. This is important for, I think, anybody, which is, he was saying that to really deeply understand these teachings, you must practice. And you must practice meditation. And there are different ways to practice meditation. And in this particular case, he was saying the solution to your problem is to practice tantric meditation. But I didn't know that. I was this sort of scholar who was interested in philosophy, and I didn't know anything about the practice of meditation. But something very interesting happened. The next day, I felt great. Having spent some weeks being miserable, I guess, or at least a week being miserable intellectually and emotionally, having fallen to the nihilistic extreme, I wasn't there anymore. It's like suddenly I was back in the middle between the two extremes of positivism, or the absolutism rather, and nihilism. This is an important event in my life. And what had happened, it took me a long time to sort through this, but what had happened was the grace or the influence of a qualified master being in the presence of such a person, even though I didn't know what he was telling me, resolved a problem. He had gotten into my mind in ways I didn't even know and tweaked my noggin in a way in which I didn't even understand, and it solved a problem which I couldn't comprehend. I know this sounds strange, but I'm sharing this story for an important reason. The important reason is that practice and studying things intellectually go together. And it's very important to realize this. Now, in this series of talks, I'm going to be talking about the nature of emptiness. And theoretically, because I'm a Nagarjuna scholar, I'm supposed to know something about it. From my point of view, for me to talk about this at all is an incredibly nervy thing to do, because this is a very complicated subject. And although I've been working with understanding the nature of emptiness in Buddhist thought since the 1970s, I'm still working on understanding the nature of this idea. It doesn't stop unfolding. The understanding comes deeper and deeper. Now, I have colleagues who continue studying commentaries and translating and working with that material, and that's all great, and that's all very important. But what I didn't understand from my experience with Ling Rinpoche was that there's another dimension. And that's the dimension that I was much more interested in exploring. It was, how does emptiness look from the point of view of practice? Not just from the point of view of an intellectual understanding, which is very important and which we'll be exploring in these lectures, but from the point of view of practice. One of the books that I've talked about in this series of lectures is the Heart Sutra. And back in March, I did a series of talks on a book called The Essence of the Heart Sutra, which was the Dalai Lama's commentary on the Heart Sutra. And in this book, he's very specific about the point that I just made. And since it may sound like I'm sounding like I'm saying something extreme, I'm going to quote His Holiness, because that gets me out of any potential hot water that I might be in for saying something that might be extreme. Or maybe it's not extreme, I don't know. Depends upon how you think about it. But anyhow, I'm going to quote His Holiness. So this is from page 120 of the book, The Essence of the Heart Sutra, and I'd show you a nice glossy cover, but I can't, because I have a bound copy of it. If you're familiar with the Heart Sutra, you know that it starts out by saying things like form is emptiness, emptiness is form, and it goes on, it says likewise, feelings, perceptions, mental formations, and consciousness are all empty. These are the 5 skandhas, these are the 5 aggregates. And in the lower schools, so-called lower schools of Buddhist thought, the Hinayana schools or the Theravada schools, they mostly focus on the emptiness of the person, which is to say, if you look at the 5 aggregates, where do you find a person? Where do you find I? Where do you find a me? Okay. And they say it's merely designated on the 5 aggregates. The Heart Sutra goes a step farther. It says each of the aggregates is empty. Some people think that means they don't exist. That would be a mistake. To say they're empty means something else entirely. But before I get to that, His Holiness. One way to understand this passage is from the perspective of a meditator realizing emptiness directly. So this is very important. Many of the teachings about the emptiness of phenomena, excuse me, I think I'm going to be losing my voice here. Many of the teachings about the emptiness of phenomena, their ultimate nature, refer to the experiences had by meditators in deep one-pointed states of meditation. They can be understood intellectually, but the main point is they refer to a state of consciousness. And that's what His Holiness is emphasizing here. One way to understand this passage, this teachings about emptiness, is from the perspective of a meditator realizing emptiness directly. Mm-hmm. Such a person directly perceives the complete absence of independent reality of all things and events, directly perceiving emptiness alone. In such a state, no multiplicity is experienced. There is no form, that means there's no material matter that's perceived. There are no feelings, no sensation, no perception, no mental formations, nor anything else at all. There is nothing but emptiness because this insight is arrived at only through the process of negating the intrinsic reality of, for instance, form. Form is a conventional reality, a relative phenomenon, and relative phenomena are only known through conventional perception. However, the emptiness of the form is the ultimate truth or ultimate reality of that form. And that ultimate reality is attained only through an ultimate analysis, only through the mind that realizes the ultimate nature of reality. This is experiential through meditation. While the mind perceives emptiness directly, it perceives nothing else. And so within such a perspective, there is no longer subject and object. So hopefully you start to get the import of this. When we try and understand the teachings about emptiness, we begin to understand them intellectually, and that's important. Based upon an intellectual understanding, we then push farther, and we begin to contemplate the meaning of that intellectual understanding when we're meditating. And I'll talk more about how you do that, or at least how I do that. Okay. And ultimately, if you're really accomplished in this practice, things shift so that the intellectual understanding of the true nature of phenomena becomes a direct experience of the true nature of phenomena. And what is that direct experience? All the phenomena disappear. Now, if you think about all the phenomena disappear from the point of view of how we exist in the conventional life that we exist in, that would seem to be nihilistic. That would be the extreme that I fell to, that His Holiness Ling Rinpoche pulled me out of, because I didn't understand that distinction. Right? I thought emptiness, oh, well, empty, 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 there's nothing there. In a state of meditation, when you're one-pointedly trying to comprehend the true nature of reality, and comprehend is a kind of a complicated word here, there is nothing. If there's no subject and no object and no intellectual activity, what exists? Now, emptiness is what exists. But see, here's the interesting thing. The emptiness of what exists when you're in deep meditation is the direct experience of the empty nature of your own consciousness. And what is that? That's the clear light mind that Ling Rinpoche was telling me about. But Nagarjuna does not talk about it. Nagarjuna does not talk about this in his philosophical works. So this is the treacherous thing that I want to alert you to before we go any farther into these teachings. Most scholars, excuse me, I'm having a hard time tonight. Most scholars won't talk about this because they're talking about this from an intellectual point of view. Well, from an intellectual point of view, it doesn't make any sense. Why? Because the ultimate reality that's experienced in meditation is not rational. You're beyond the rational mind. So of course it doesn't make any sense. If it made any sense, it would be wrong. If it made any sense to your rational mind, it would be incorrect. Right? Now that sounds crazy. What kind of a philosophy is this that says, if it makes sense to your rational mind, it's incorrect? Right? But it's a philosophy that's grounded in practice. It's not just grounded in intellectual understanding. But the remarkable thing about the Tibetan tradition is it says, but the intellectual understanding is important. You have to get it right first, so you know what to look for in your meditative practice. Otherwise, you could be looking in the wrong place. Lama Zopa talks about this. You have to look in the right place. If you look in the wrong place, you're not going to get any place. You know, it's like looking at a map and saying, okay, I'm in Santa Fe and I want to go to Albuquerque. And what do? I'm not going to look at a map. Oh, maybe I'll just listen to Google Maps. They always send me to the wrong place. And I'm going to end up in Pecos, which, by the way, is a very nice place, but it's not Albuquerque, right? You need to know where you're going. So the intellectual understanding is like the roadmap that helps you get there. But you know the old Buddhist story of you take the raft to the shore of enlightenment, and when you get to the shore of enlightenment, you don't put the raft on your back and drag it around, you leave it behind. So the intellectual teachings of the raft that take you there. I'm sorry, this may end up being a short class. Okay. I've been belaboring this point for an important reason. It's because it's an important point. From the intellectual point of view, if we talk about the nature of emptiness, which is the true nature of phenomena, what are we talking about now? Let me sort of shift back to that. It's usually said, at least in the Mahayana teachings, that the emptiness that's being discussed is the emptiness of inherent existence, or the emptiness of intrinsic existence, or the emptiness of true existence. There are different ways of phrasing this in English, none of which is really wonderfully adequate. And even the word itself, emptiness, is not wonderfully adequate. Personally, I like the term devoidness, which is clumsy and terrible English, but it's actually a bit more accurate. And why is it more accurate? It's more accurate because when we're talking about the true nature of phenomena, we're talking about the way things appear and the way they actually exist. Okay? The way they appear is they appear as if existence, the existence that they seem to have, is in their nature, that it inheres or is intrinsic to their nature. And in fact, if I did a whole gloss on the Sanskrit or the Tibetan for what's being talked about here, this would be explained further. I'm not going to do that, though. I mean, if you're really interested in that, you can go to my book on the 70 stanzas in the chapter called Object. And I do talk about that in great detail. But the point is that phenomena and their empty nature or their devoid nature are two aspects of the same thing. Okay, this is a little bit perhaps hard to grasp. Why is that? Okay, we look at things and we naturally see them as if they're whole, as if they're independent or autonomous, and as if they possess the characteristics we see in them. Okay, so these are three categories or classic ways of looking at the problem. That everything we experience, conventionally speaking, if we don't think about it very much, right, seems to be a whole. I use the example of a table. last week, right? When you look at a table, you don't think about the parts of the table. Lama Zopa talks about this in the book also. If you walk into a room and you see a table, the first thing you do is you just see a table. You don't think anything of it. It's a table. But if you really thought about what you were looking at, which you don't generally do, you would see it's made up out of parts. And if you really deeply thought about what it is that you're looking at, you'd also realize that it's transitory, it's impermanent, it's changing, that it came from somewhere and it's going somewhere. And you just happen to be looking at it in a certain moment in time. So it just appears to be sitting there the way it is. But if you had a big, broad perspective on things, you see that it came from somewhere and it's going somewhere, and that it's made up out of parts, and that the parts were dependent upon other parts. The other thing is, and again, this is what Lama Zopa emphasizes, you realize, if you thought about it really closely, that it's only a table because you call it a table. I meditate on a coffee table in front of my little shrine here, and I said, I'd like to call it a throne, right? And well, yeah, it's really a table. Yeah, but I don't consider it a table. I consider it something I sit on. It's more like a chair without a back, right? What's the difference? It's the same coffee table, right? Okay, in my mind, it's one thing. Somebody else walks into the house and looks at it, it's a coffee table. It's something else entirely. Except maybe for the fact that there's a Tibetan rug and a meditation cushion sitting on it. They might get the clue. But anyway, what the thing is, if we really pay attention to it, is what we think it is. That's all it is. It's what we think it is. And if we stop thinking it's that thing, could we in fact recognize it for what it actually is apart from our labeling of it? So that's the big question, right? Could we experience it devoid of or empty of our labeling of it? Now, the Buddhists assert that if you can do this, then you get at what it really is instead of what it appears to be. Okay. The Vietnamese Zen monk Thich Nhat Hanh has a great example. He says, if you pick up a book and you start reading the book and you look at the pages of the book, do you see the cloud in the page of the book? If you see the cloud in the page of the book, you're seeing reality. What does he mean? Okay, a page of a book is made of paper. Paper is made of wood. Wood is made of trees. What are trees? Trees are made of earth, air, water. What does the water come from? Clouds. He's saying if you can really see what the page is, you'll see what it's made of. Where does it come from? That's what's actually there, what we don't see. Now that's what's actually there conventionally. So see, here's the interesting thing. Usually when we talk about getting at what's actually there, in the context of this kind of talk, we're talking about the empty nature of phenomena. But what phenomena are devoid of is our fictional ideas about phenomena. So if we're in a meditative state, we might be experiencing nothing whatsoever. But in the state of conventional experience, conventional reality, it's possible to experience the interconnectedness of everything, the dependent nature of everything, the actual true nature of things in a conventional sense. As the cowherds pointed out, there's conventional truth and ultimate truth. Both are true. It's not like conventional truth is false. Conventional truth is true. What is the truth about the conventional nature of things? Well, on the one hand, the ultimate truth about the nature of things is that they're empty. But the conventional truth about the nature of things is that they're dependent arisings. They come from somewhere, they're going somewhere. They exist in dependence upon something else, right? They're made up out of parts. They appear to be wholes, but they're actually made up out of parts. And they appear to be what they appear to be because of the way we label them. Now, who gives a toss about this in regards to a table? Does it really matter? Well, it's nice to know that anything you happen to buy or possess is going to fall apart and is not going to last for a long time. Particularly nice to think about that in regards to cars. My car has 100,000 miles on it. I'm hoping it'll get to 200,000 miles because I can't afford another car. But the reality is, I'm also going to have to spend a lot of money maintaining the car because it's in a constant state of falling apart now that it has 100,000 miles on it, right? So am I going to grouse about that and be unhappy about that? No, it's just the nature of how things are. So I better have enough money around to keep my car functioning. Okay, trivial example, much more interesting example, my body. And I talked about this, right? This body is now 76 years old. It's really in a state of falling apartness. I have to work really hard to keep it from falling apart any faster than it's falling apart. I exercise regularly. I eat well. I try and control my blood pressure and my stress, right? These are things that I have to do. If I don't do them, I start not functioning very well. You know, 20 or 30 years ago, exercise was optional. 20 or 30 years ago, eating pepperoni pizza was, if I wanted to, that's fine. It's not optional anymore, okay? These things don't work because the body is falling apart. Okay, well, you know, most of the people in this class are not young anymore. So they get it. Okay, but here's something that's really more interesting. Remember His Holiness saying that it's also the mind that perceives everything, which is devoid of inherent existence, I read earlier? That's where it gets really interesting. So look, we all think, well, you know, if the essence of what I am is not my body, because we're more sophisticated philosophically than that, and then the essence of what I am is what? Oh, maybe it's my consciousness. Is there anyone that doesn't experience their own awareness of their own consciousness as being persistent, as being singular, as being unchanging, as being definitively what it appears to be? I know what my consciousness is. I know what I'm aware of. I know what awareness is. I experience it all the time, right? Well, if my mind or my consciousness is devoid of permanence, is devoid of wholeness, and is devoid of my labeling of what it appears to be, then something really shocking has to occur to me. For one thing, and remember I said earlier on, if the teachings of emptiness don't unnerve you, then you're not quite getting them, okay? For one thing, I think my consciousness is just there, like a thing, like an entity, which is aware of everything. Well, Buddhists say that it's made up of parts. So what are those parts? Well, there are a couple of ways of thinking about this. One way of thinking about conventional everyday consciousness is it's a phenomenon of moments. It exists in time. The consciousness that was the consciousness you had when this class began from this way of thinking is not the consciousness that exists right now. It's different. It's changed. Now, that doesn't mean that its identity has ultimately changed, does it? Or does it? I've experienced my awareness of being in this situation with you as having continuity and being the same over the last 48 minutes. But is it? Is it really the same? The Buddhist argument is that it's not. It's made up of moments. Okay. It's dependent upon causes and conditions. What does that mean? That means that my consciousness depends on something that was in existence before. Excuse me. And were it not for that thing, which was in existence before, my consciousness would not be here now in this moment. Okay. Let's try and think about this a little bit more deeply. When I say consciousness, what do I mean? How do you know what consciousness is? How do you know what your mind is? How do you know you have a mind? Everybody knows they have a mind, right? Everybody knows they have a consciousness. I mean, maybe most people don't think about it. My plumber probably doesn't think about it very much, even though he's a very smart guy. But if I asked him about it, he's smart enough to be able to say, oh yeah, I am aware of what's going on. So I do have a mind, I do have a consciousness. Most of the time he doesn't think about it. He's busy making a lot of money as a plumber, and he's very happy doing that. But what do we mean when we say I have a mind? How do we know I have a mind? Well, what's occurred to me is the way I know that I have a mind or a consciousness is I remember that there was a time when I didn't have one, which is to say, last night, I went to bed at 10:30. I lay there for a while and I thought, I hope I can fall asleep. And about 12:30, suddenly I was awake and I was thirsty. I looked at the clock and 2 hours had gone by, and I was not aware of those 2 hours going by. But now I'm aware of the fact that 2 hours has gone by without my being aware of the fact that 2 hours has gone by. What does that mean? It means there's a period of time when I wasn't aware of anything, which means now I am aware of something. Oh, now I know what awareness is, because I know what not awareness is. So it's occurred to me, the only reason we're aware or are conscious or know what consciousness is that we fall asleep at night. If we didn't, I know this sounds strange. If we didn't fall asleep at night and know that, oh, I went to bed and it was dark and I woke up and it's light, something happened, but I wasn't aware of it, then we wouldn't know what awareness was, which is now that I'm aware of the fact that I wasn't aware. So now I know what awareness is. So consciousness is dependent upon unconsciousness in its own weird way. But that's conventional consciousness, okay? That's ordinary consciousness. From a tantric point of view or a Vajrayana point of view, there's a kind of consciousness that did not disappear when I was sound asleep. Okay, but I've talked about that in other talks. I'm not going to go there too much now. That was the clear light mind that Lama Rinpoche was telling me about. I didn't know what it was. Okay, that's the point I'm trying to make here in this kind of weird and obscure way. What we know about our consciousness is dependent upon a lot of other factors. And the reality is that our consciousness is really quite other than what we think it is. This is the Buddhist argument. We label something as consciousness, as awareness, as my mind, which is the most important thing to me, more important than my body probably. Right? We label that and we think we understand it and we know it because it's there with us all the time, right? Wrong. A, it's not there with us all the time. And B, we don't really know what it is. We think we know what it is. Okay. And because we think we know what it is, we're not going to find out what it is. The best way to find out what it is to realize that what we think it is just us labeling it as being something. Like, I know what it is. I know this is sounding really strange. Okay. I know what it is. And that's the reason why I'm not going to know what it is, because I only know what it is conventionally. I know what people told me about it. I know what I learned about the mind at UCLA when I was a psychology student. They told me all about the mind. I know lots of stuff about the mind. What mind did they tell me about? They told me about the conventional mind of interactions, but they didn't tell me anything about what the essential nature of the mind is. And why is that? Because they don't know. The philosophers who are now dealing with the question of consciousness have gotten as far as saying it's the, quote, difficult problem, unquote. And they're working their way into it, but how far are they getting? Perhaps not very far. Why? Because they're using their intellectual mind to try and understand the nature of consciousness. Now, the neuroscientists are perhaps doing a little bit better because they're looking at brain function and they're looking at the electromagnetic fields that are associated with different states of mind. So they're kind of objectively looking at something. But are they really getting at the nature of consciousness? Well, that's kind of an interesting question. And there's a lot of debate about whether they're really getting at the nature of consciousness or not. I don't know the answer to that. I suspect that they're getting at a kind of consciousness, but are they getting at the essence of consciousness? Now, Nagarjuna and all of his students who've been following this philosophy of emptiness that he laid out so extraordinarily have looked at the question of what is the emptiness nature of the mind? What is the emptiness nature of the mind? So in meditation, you can wrestle with this problem, and then that becomes the point. Because when you're meditating, you can look at your own awareness, your breathing, you can watch your breath, you can hear the dogs barking around, the traffic, you can feel your sore behind or your legs falling asleep or whatever the case may be, all of which happens to me, by the way, when I'm trying to meditate. Nature of my neighborhood. What's aware of those things? Now, when I approach that question, I think I know what's aware of those things. But if I apply the analysis of emptiness to my own awareness, okay, A, it's not what I think it is. B, it's a phenomenon of time, moments. And C, it arises dependently. And I hold those three thoughts, as it were, in my mind when I look at the nature of my mind. I know this is mind looking at mind. It's starting to sound a little weird. Something happens. And the mind begins to reveal itself underneath the labels. I read a quotation, I read His Holiness someplace many, many years ago in a book. I cannot find this quotation for the life of me. I've tried. He says, if you meditate on the actual nature of the mind, if you meditate on the actual nature of consciousness, that's how you make the greatest progress. The greatest progress toward what? Well, if you understand the actual nature of the mind, stuff starts to happen. For one thing, one of the things that starts to happen is the habit patterns that control you begin to lose their potency. Why? Well, you'll see how they lose their potency when you meditate on the nature of mind, because they arise in the mind and then they fade away in the mind. And when you begin to dwell in the actual nature of the mind, its emptiness nature, you're not hooked by them anymore. So remember that the Buddhist enterprise is about finding liberation and ultimately finding enlightenment. So this is part of the process of getting there. Okay. So I've been at this for an hour now, and I put a lot of stuff out there, and I'm looking at what's happening on the screen here, the people I'm looking at, and I'm seeing some yawning and some tired looking folks. That's okay. You know, I'm not the most engaging teacher, and we're doing this over the internet and so on and so forth, and this is hard material. So I'm thinking that maybe I should call it quits at the moment and give you the opportunity to digest this. This will be recorded, or this is recorded rather, and it'll be available on YouTube in the next day or two, so you can go back over it and begin to think about it. Because thinking and understanding these concepts is the first step. But remember what I'm emphasizing. The point is sitting on your meditation cushion and discovering how this really applies to yourself and your mind. Because that's where you're going to find the way in which you're free. And it will also, by the way, change how you perceive conventional reality. So you're going to know your car is going to need maintenance and fall apart. And by the way, so is your body and everything else around you. It's just the way it is. So there's no point in grousing about it and getting crunchy about it. As I mentioned last week, my poor father was really unhappy about getting old and falling apart. He crabbed about it to the end of his life. I mean, what is the point of that? There's no point. You know, someone told me that there was some, I wish I could remember this. We have the Drepung Losling monks at Thupten Norbuling doing a Sand Mandala of Akshobhya. And I was talking to one of the local Sangha that I know, and we were talking about this particular issue, and she said, oh yeah, there was this quotation, this Christian quotation that really stuck with her about growing old. It was something like, may I accept, let's see if I can do this correctly. May I accept the loss of the things of youth gracefully. She said, gracefully. That's the hard part. So, you know, this is the route to gracefully as far as I'm concerned. Okay. That seems like a nice place to stop. If there are questions, I'd be glad to take questions and see if I can answer them. And if not, we'll reconvene in a week, and I'll see if I can find something else to say that will tie your noggin in a knot. Yes, Aida.
Here we go.
Okay.
Just some comments, about the emptiness of things and conventional reality. Repurposing things like you've done with your table. It's a great way to not be so stiff and not see our reality as so stiff, as so solid. Everything's so malleable, and we're so adaptable. And my mother was a great master of that, of recreating reality out of need. She would recreate our environment in many ways, from my sister's enormous skirts that were used in the 60s, 70s, I can't remember, 50s. She would make incredible coats for me, for example, and she would recreate our reality in many different ways by using things, repurposing things. And that's a way to be less stiff, like if you see on the background, that little altar that I have, it's made out of cardboard boxes that had Mexican candy at one point, but now there's something else. And it's so easy to be adaptable. And of course, there is no ultimate reality with that conventional reality. People forget that.
Right.
That's all. That's what I wanted to say.
Well, let me then segue on that, because it's not like I want to have the last word, but it occurred to me one day in walking on the beach that life in the conventional world is really all about art. And that's what you're talking about, turning life into art. And that's my sort of shorthand crib on the issue. My wife excels in making the ordinary beautiful. People walk into our house and they go, holy cow, it is so colorful. There's this and there's that, all this beautiful stuff. I mean, I kind of crab about, oh, there's so much stuff all over the place. But Kay says, it's all beautiful stuff to look at. I still crab about it, but there it is. So I'm in complete agreement with you. So maybe somebody else could say something else so I don't have the last word. You want to say something else, Aida? You muted yourself. You have to unmute.
Yeah. Let me see what I can say. That each one of us is our own world. Our conventional reality is what we agree on. It's so simple. And the ultimate is what really demonstrates what reality is.
Next week. Thank you.